Hey guys, it's Eric here, and I'm back with another episode of the Engaging with Eric podcast. In this episode, I'm joined by Sarah Saeed and Wakila Latidoye to discuss whether the war in Ukraine has exposed Western hypocrisy and double standards in humanitarianism. Sarah, a past guest on my YouTube channel, is a public policy professional specializing in government, international, and political affairs. A former parliamentary political advisor to an Irish minister and government leader, and former teaching assistant of international relations, theories of international relations, comparative politics and political theory at the University College Dublin. Sarah comes from a diverse heritage, which gives her an insight into more than one lens. She's a family person who believes community is important, and she cares deeply about bettering the world that we live in. Wakila, a fellow NUIG student and personal friend of mine, is a 22-year-old studying commerce at NUI Galway, with a keen interest in accounting and data. She's a Muslim of Togo descent who has lived in Ireland for the majority of her life. Wakila concerns herself with issues related to justice and equality and strives towards making the world a more fair place. In this episode, the ladies and I discuss the discrepancy in language used to describe those affected by the war in Ukraine as compared to wars in other parts of the world. We discuss what we believe is at the heart of the discrepancy, the importance of Europe embodying its most cherished values by applying them consistently, despite who the victim is, and not simply speaking of their worth. The comments made by the Deputy Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, to justify the difference in the treatment of refugees, the challenge but importance of Europe living up to its values in a shared Europe, and lots more. This was certainly a fruitful conversation that needs to be had. If the values espoused in Europe mean anything to us, values such as the respect for human rights and the respect for human dignity, values such as equality and democracy, we must see to it that we continue to champion them, apply them indiscriminately, and jump at any opportunity to rectify our ways if we begin to stray away from them, not least when this is done for tribalistic reasons. This was certainly a conversation that I took a lot from, and I hope you take a lot from it too. Without further delay, here it is.
Hey guys, it's Eric here, and I'm back with another episode of the Engaging with Eric podcast. And in this episode, I'm joined by two very, very special guests, Wakila and Sarah.
Hi, how are you?
Really good. So happy to be joined by both of you for this episode. Of course, the topic we're discussing is very germane and has been talked about a lot in the media, on social media, but also amongst political commentators, I'd say. It's as everyone knows, I'm sure, people watching the podcast, rather the video on YouTube or they're listening to the podcast, and as three of us know, there's currently an invasion taking place in Ukraine right now. Russia, about just over a fortnight ago, I believe, invaded Ukraine. And it's all over the media, of course, and what they're doing there is inhumane and atrocious. But there are particular periphery issues that have flowed from it and subtopics that have flowed from it that has allowed for us to have a conversation about other aspects and other facets of our society. And one thing that people have been talking about, one thing that has been quite notable, is the media discrepancy in the coverage of what's happening in Ukraine right now, and how refugees have been treated, generally speaking, the discrepancy in the approach to refugees. People have shared videos from media outlets about how media personalities have talked about how in the war in Ukraine, it's specific and idiosyncratic in that the people who are affected, this is media outlets in Europe who have said this, figures from media outlets in Europe, people have referenced their race, people have referenced their socioeconomic background, people have referenced the geographic position of Ukraine. I think Ryan Turbiddy, in one of his in his radio show in the morning, he talked about how looking at people in Ukraine who are affected by this war is like looking at someone who comes from his neighborhood, looking at people who he can relate to. People have found this to be somewhat problematic and troublesome. People have even referenced the religion of people in Ukraine. I believe Christianity was cited. And of course, this has kickstarted a conversation about, as stated previously, the discrepancy in media coverage with wars elsewhere beyond the borders of Europe and wars in Ukraine. So I'm sure, I know that both of you have seen the coverage on this discrepancy and possibly noticed it yourself. And I don't think it's an issue that should be evaded. And I do want to state this from the outset. I imagine that lots of people might see that bringing this issue up is evading the wider issue, what some might see as the wider issue being the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. But I think this occurring means that now more than ever, we have to talk about the values that matter to us and the importance of standing by these values. You can't simply invoke these values when it might suit a particular political narrative. We have to consistently and universally apply these values. And if that is to be done, we have to talk about injustice wherever it manifests itself and issues that manifest from broader issues. So what was your reaction, ladies, when you first saw coverage on the media discrepancy, let's say between wars in Afghanistan, Syria, and wars in Ukraine, a description of the people who have been affected? Any of you can chime in first.
I can start. So I think it's really important to state the intersectionality that I am part of. So I'm a Black woman who's also a Muslim, and throughout the decades, we've seen coverages from places in Africa and places in the Middle East. Both I can relate to if they are Muslim in the Middle East, and if they are Black in Africa. And it's really upsetting to see the description that was thrown about when it came to non-Ukrainians being described, if that makes sense. Because it was just one video where the person said, these are not people from Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, these are civilized individuals. And the point, no one had a big issue with the coverage until the description of non-Ukrainians were being made. I think that's what hit me the most, because not once did I think, oh wow, this is amazing, Ukrainians are being helped and everybody else is not being helped. Once I saw the way that people were speaking about everybody that wasn't Ukrainian, that's when it really started to irritate me, and it started to the discrepancy that you talk about really started to show, because it went from human beings being pushed out of their homes to certain human beings being pushed out of their homes. And that's not what humanity is about. We're all supposed to be united in our front. We're all supposed to be helping everybody, not a particular group of people. So the description of Ukrainians and the descriptions of everybody that wasn't Ukrainians. And I think it's really important to understand that within the group of Ukrainians, there was also discrimination within said group. We all saw the videos of Black students, Black families, Black citizens of Ukraine who were treated very badly by Ukrainians themselves and by other borders. And it was very shocking to see that even in the face of war, the skin color that you hold or the religion that you stand for can lead to a lesser treatment of you simply because of that, if that makes sense. It was almost like you were second class, third class even, depending on the hierarchy that you're looking at. And it was very, very shocking, because we all thought human beings were human beings, as much as we like to say we don't see color, we don't see religion. Clearly we do, if we're making a clear depiction between X and Y and Z. So I think my first reaction was like, okay, this is weird. I remember seeing it on my Snapchat, and a lot of my friends were reposting videos from TikTok. And my first reaction was, okay, let me actually do some research. What's actually going on? Why are they being treated like this? And all it took was maybe a few, not even a few hours, of me just getting constant live footage of Black individuals who are being mistreated. And we're not even going to talk about the men, because Ukraine was only technically allowing children and women to pass at that point. But even then, it was children and women of a darker skin tone, of a different religion, that were being mistreated. And it was very alarming, very, I don't want to say unexpected, because I think deep down as a Black woman, you kind of expect certain discriminations to be thrown at you. And then living as a Muslim woman in a country where it's majority Christian as well, you kind of expect looks, you kind of expect certain behaviors. That doesn't mean doesn't mean it affects us any less. It still hurts to see it happen, but you get a hard shell from it, and it kind of bounces off you. But seeing it at such an escalated scale, seeing it as such a a detrimental situation was very, very alarming. Yeah, that was my take on it.
Yeah, thanks so much,
Thank
Wakila. And I think before passing it on to you, Sarah, I want to quickly contextualize something you said, Wakila, about what's happening at the border. So for those who might not know, some people were rejected from passage from the Ukrainian border into Poland, and there was preferential treatment for natives at the border. And of course, this affected many people who are Black in Ukraine, many people who are not from Ukraine, you could say, ethnically or indigenously. And this is what Wakila was referring to. And there was coverage on this, of course, in the BBC. There was a story of a lady called Jessica who was pregnant, and she tried to seek transport to get from the Ukrainian border into Poland. And she was told that if you're Black, you must walk. You can't board this passage. And I think the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry addressed this. They put out a video, and it's somewhat gaslighted what's occurring at the border. But again, I stated earlier, and as we'll touch on throughout the conversation, I think it's worthy of pointing to any manifestation of injustice. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. So I think it's always worthy of talking about. So thanks so much, Wakila. Sarah, would you like to chime in?
Thanks, Wakila and Eric. Yeah, I think my initial reaction was like, is this really happening? Are these journalists really saying this? You know, like, in terms of like they're, you know, it's part of storytelling. It's a narrative, the media narrative. You know, they want to depict and tell the story of what's going on in Ukraine. That, you know, a democratic country has been invaded by Russia, by, you know, a country that does not respect democratic values, and so. But then when it started to compare the situation on the ground in Ukraine to other regions in a way that, just to be honest, to me didn't feel like very European, or didn't adhere to the European values of, respect for human dignity and life. So it kind of shocked me, but at the same time didn't shock me, we have to remember something though. It wasn't too long ago that countries in Central Europe and Eastern Europe were also seen as, countries that were, dealt with in a kind of discriminatory fashion as well by Western European politicians, So it wasn't too long ago that they were also suffering from the same kind of prejudice. Like even just recently, the Polish community, when UK was leaving the European Union and Brexit was happening, hate crime against the Polish community, skyrocketed and went through the roof, So like there's still a prejudice there towards Central and Eastern European countries and people. So it surprised me, but didn't surprise me. I think what surprised me was the lack of empathy and humanity in these journalists, and even like journalists back home in Ireland, the notion that, that the need to explain that the person had to have, and not that he didn't say that the person had to have blonde or, hair or blue eyes, but the fact that they could relate to that. And I kind of was like, could you stop for a moment and, stop relating to people on a physical attributes or their physical traits, but relate to people as people. People in the Middle East and people in Africa do have Netflix. They do, watch YouTube. They do, they're probably the highest consumers when it comes to social media platforms for TikTok and YouTube and so on. They do have beautiful lives. They are educated. They're highly actually educated and have degrees and so on. So it kind of like, I just found, I was like, are we that narrow-minded? Is the West really, really that narrow-minded and uneducated to the world and how the world works? But also, like, another point was kind of the discrepancy and the disparity of the media. Especially, I don't know if you remember in 2015, this Syrian father who was carrying his son, I think at the Hungarian border, was tripped up by a journalist. And I don't know. I'm sure, any father could identify with him, you know what I mean, as being a father trying to get his son to safety. So it blew my mind in terms of the narrative and storytelling around that. And it felt very much undemocratic and not of the values that the West, adheres to or claims to have. So I found it a bit shocking in that regard. But at the same time, not too shocking. I think there is an absolute obsession and about Muslims, and about the fear of Islam and the Islamophobia and so on. They're trying to continue a narrative. Even if you saw when this whole situation with Syria happened, Syria also, like the destruction of Aleppo was due to Russia, and its role in the conflict there. When Syrians were fleeing, what way did the media paint the whole picture? They painted it as the migration crisis for Europe. It wasn't a migration crisis for Europe. It was a conflict situation where refugees were seeking help, and it shocked me. I've been to Lebanon. I've seen how Lebanon have taken in refugees and are trying their very best, particularly with children with disabilities and children with autism and so on. And it just blows my mind that, you have a narrative and a rhetoric in Europe that you have, right-wing politicians saying we'll accept Ukrainian refugees, but not Muslim refugees. And to me, that's not Europe. There was someone had tweeted and said, this is Europe, and I'm like, no, that's not Europe. Europe is about democratic values. It's about human rights. And I think it's really important that countries like Ireland and in Western Europe actually stand up to that rhetoric and say, actually, no, we don't accept any of this nonsense, because this is not what we adhere to.
Really poignant. Yeah, they're really poignant, Sarah. I'm going to return to a lot of the points that you made with this next question that I'm going to ask, which is basically about the root of this rhetoric, the root of this language, this lexicon. And essentially, when all of this unfolded, you could say, I saw a lot of this coverage in the media and a lot of commentary on this and on social media and from different media personalities and political commentators. I had to think about what was occurring, the type of rhetoric being used, and what it might mean, what the source of this rhetoric might be, and where it might come from. And my initial reaction, I think, impulsively speaking, I was quite aggravated by listening to this language because I think the discrepancy is obvious. It's obvious. It's plain to see. But I tried to have a think about where this might come from, and it led to a kind of long process of reasoning that I've only come to the end of really prior to this video. And I think I shared some of my thoughts with you, both of you, before this video, this podcast episode was actually recorded. So my initial thought was that, the discrepancy was wrong, and I still think that it is. Then after that, after a process of reasoning, I thought about the argument that we were hearing now. I think Artona Shalio Varadkar used this argument, the argument on proximity. So because Ukraine is in Europe and is in closer proximity, you could say, to Ireland and other European countries, there's been an argument posed about whether that means that the language used to speak about what's occurring in Ukraine relative to argument to the language used to speak about what's occurring elsewhere is somewhat proportionate. And this was an argument at first that I found it hard to kind of dismantle this, and I think I favored it to a certain extent. I thought about the fact that I live in Longford, and if something had happened in Northern Ireland, I'd be scared, but I wouldn't be too scared because it's a bit away, but it's happening on the island of Ireland. If it happened in Dublin, that's far closer, but that's the capital, and you hear horror stories, unfortunately, pertaining to crime, let's say, far more frequently than you might in my town. But then if it happened in my town, I'd be incredibly scared. I'd definitely be thinking about what my next move is. And if it happened in my estate, I'd be talking to my family about how we need to leave the estate and seek safety. But I talked to a friend about this, a German friend about this, in Belgium, and I talked about this argument on proximity and whether he thought that this was an explanatory factor that could contextualize the language used. And he said no, because if we're going to use the argument based on geographic proximity, we have to account for Algeria, which is closer to a lot of European countries than Ukraine might be. So it's somewhat of a nonsensical argument. Then I went back to the drawing board and I thought about it a bit more. And I think he said that he believed why language that is far more fierce and intense is being used to talk about the Ukrainian crisis is because of the fact that the crisis is occurring within Europe. And I think Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach, you heard this reflected in what he said. I believe he said that it's understandable that the reaction to Ukraine is far more stronger because of the fact that, far more strong because of the fact that Ukraine is in, quote unquote, our neighborhood. But my conclusion, ultimately, that I've come to is if it's essentially what you said, Sarah, that here in Europe, a particular set of values have been espoused ever since you could say the European project was established, pertaining to a respect for human dignity, a respect for human rights, equality. And that sets a very kind of clear, concrete benchmark out for Europe. And any deviation from that benchmark is worthy of penalization and should be sanctioned and cannot be incentivized. So to see others as being those who don't belong in, quote unquote, a neighborhood is a regressive kind of old age way of seeing things. It's how Europe saw things prior to the world wars, that kind of restrictive, tribalistic mode of thought. And I think a friend of ours, Sarah Momobo, who studies social psychology, she put out a tweet referencing to Ryan Tubridy's comments that I referred to earlier about how in-group, out-group thinking is a way of our modes of thoughts pertaining to the Homo sapien. We sometimes think in tribalistic ways to favor those who fall within our in-group. And although that can be naturalistically explained, that doesn't mean it is to be incentivized. It doesn't mean you encourage that way of thinking, particularly if you live in a part of the world where, as stated previously, a set amount of values, cherished values, are put at a particular level. You have to strive towards those values. It makes no sense to run away from them, even if you can explain the incentive to run away from them. So the conclusion that I came to is that the source of all of this, I think there's probably a diverse range of sources. None of them, even if they're reasonable and legitimate, can justify the discrepancy. The discrepancy is something that needs to be fought and challenged. So I wonder what your thoughts are on the question, what you think the source is and what
I think like what Momobo highlighted is important to counter, like to take into effect and to take into account is the idea that, empathy, we empathize more with our in groups. Yeah, I understand that that's a kind of can be an innate thing, but it doesn't just justify things. Not in this era. Not, we've developed and we've come so far, and we talk about unconscious bias, and we try to, talk about inclusion policy and all this kind of stuff that I just don't find it justifiable anymore. I feel like this kind of narrative is rooted in, the typical kind of medieval stereotype of Europe and civilized Europe, and anything on the in the hinterlands is uncivilized, and I have an issue with that because then there's a narrative there that's saying we haven't seen such a crisis since the Second World War II. Oh yes, we have. Bosnia, we have. And why are we removing that from our history, from European history? Because that's there. Or about 100,000 people died, approximately. 50,000, I believe it's 50,000 women were raped, and children from 7 years old, girls were raped in that, and that was the most horrific genocide that Europe had seen since World War II, and it was the complete ethnic cleansing of, Bosnian Muslims. So like, I don't know, I wonder, is it, kind of being ignored? Or are we going to, beat around the bushes and say, oh, but they're not being invaded? But they were, in a way, because it was Serbia, So it just, I don't know. I find it like there's a lot of beating around the bush, and I just want people to say it as it is. It's racism. It's the racist dehumanization of people, and of refugees, and that's what it is. When it comes to Leo Varadkar, or Taoiseach's remarks, it's so unfortunate for a leader to talk like that. So unfortunate. But I wonder who his advisors are, you know what I mean, and how open are they in terms of their way and view of the world and how they see the world. Because what about the European neighborhood policy that includes regions that are in conflict, like North Africa, and extends out to Syria, actually, or do we only foster relationships within that European neighborhood policy when it favors European interests alone, and then when there's a crisis, we just shut the door or the borders on them? So it just, it again, I feel like sometimes it's a colonial mindset. It's a, a kind of a superiority complex that I really hope that we really just get rid of, because even just this idea that, we're helping our local neighborhood or our parish, or it's in Europe. Again, Bosnia. And at the moment, nobody's talking about it, but there seems to be an issue happening in Bosnia. Are we going to look there again, or are we going to ignore it? And again, this doesn't take away from what's happening in Ukraine. It's really important. But again, we cannot conflate or confuse criticism of media narrative or criticism of politicians and how they, display things or how they say things to, it's not a condemnation of what's going on, you know what I mean? And, so it's important that we don't conflate that, and that we, understand that it is important. Like, I had this discussion with my partner about, this idea that some people have said that racism, it's not the right time to be discussing it in the middle of a crisis. I was discussing it with them, saying it is actually the most important time to discuss it, because naturally, the things that happen within the Ukrainian border, where foreign residents of Ukraine were trying to get out and they couldn't get out, and they were sent back to the back of the line, or Black Ukrainians sent back of the line, and so on. And it's important that we discuss that, because they're in a situational crisis, and when you're in a situational crisis, you want the people around you and the people that you connect with to survive. And you push everyone else around you. It's kind of part of human nature. Anyone who's been in a war zone will understand it. I've witnessed it on the ground in post-conflict Libya. I've seen it, how, it becomes like the Hunger Games, So I'm not judging that. It's a human nature thing. But I am judging those that are not in that situation, who are trying to help, should ensure that the most vulnerable are also helped, and that everybody is getting the access to the services that they need and getting the help that they need. There is now, I believe, the EU recently issued a framework for non-Ukrainians to process non-Ukrainian refugees to have the same rights as Ukrainian refugees in Europe. But there's uncertainty around that. Nobody knows the information about that, how many people will be allowed on that, and so on. So there's a lot around it that needs to be discussed and addressed. And I think our Taoiseach's words are so unhelpful and so narrow-minded and unfortunate.
Yeah, those are fantastic points, Sarah. And Wakila, I know I'm going to, of course, not allow you to chime in, but just to briefly comment, the point you made about conflation, I think it's ludicrous for anybody to conflate what's occurring. I understand the emotional incentive to do that. I get it, but again, like what we said about the natural explanation for the feelings people might have or harbor towards Ukrainians in Europe that's not felt towards people beyond the borders of Europe. There's a naturalistic explanation that you can provide, but not a naturalistic justification you could provide. There's a difference between both. And I think it is absurd to conflate the two issues and act as if we can only take a singular approach in the issues that we talk about. I think if the values that are being espoused right now, rightfully, in the what you could say ideological but also de facto war against Russia mean anything, you will apply these values indiscriminately. You'll stand for these values in every situation for what they mean, for their essence. And I think the Taoiseach's comments were quasi-ideological in the sense that the neighborhood idea, I think it's really restrictive and limiting. And that these values that one might invoke at this time, human rights, respect for human dignity, these aren't limited. These are restrictive. If Ireland or Europe was an autocratic bloc that was like anti-democracy, anti-human rights, well, I wouldn't be surprised then with the rhetoric. But if you set a standard out for yourself that aims to fight these types of regimes and aims to actually fight in favor of democracy, then we have to try and ensure our rhetoric is in line with these values. And therefore, I think restrictive rhetoric is unwarranted, unnecessary, and contradictory. So I totally agree with everything. Wakila, I wonder what you have to say on the matter.
Sorry. Yeah. So in terms of where the roots come from, I honestly believe it starts from colonization. And I know that's way back in history, but I think it's really important to understand that during colonization, Europeans went to other countries and deemed themselves superior to these people, came back to their countries and said the exact same thing. And I think it's really important to understand why they did this. I've always equated it to the farmers. So there was a time in European history where if you were too dark, when you were in the sun and you were a white person, you were poor because it meant that you were working on the fields. And there were people who were in manors that put on white powder to look more pale in order to look of an upper class. So I honestly believe this rhetoric that they established in their hometowns was taken and was distributed across the world when colonization was occurring. So it was a problem that obviously led to racism, whether it's Black people, Latina, Hispanic, Asians, whatever it is. It was a rhetoric that led to said racism. But now we're in a world where we know about said rhetoric, but now the racism is very, very subtle. We have it in the form of microaggressions. We have it in the forms of just subtle behaviors that people do, certain things that people do. I think it's very comical that the EU stands for, or just Europe stands for democracy, stands for freedom, stands for human rights, yet is the same unity that has been oppressing Muslims for years. And it's only really been in the limelight and in the last few years, I'd say, in terms of France, France in particular, where you colonize Muslim countries and now we're upset that Muslim people were coming to your country. And it went so far to ban the niqab, to ban the hijab, under 18s, to the point where there was a bill that was trying to be passed where you could require a Muslim woman to take off her hijab if it was inappropriate for the workplace. And this is the EU trying to pass this bill, or it's going around. And I think it's only now being shoved in people's faces because of the scale of the Ukrainian crisis, because of the scale of the amount of refugees that are being discriminated against. All of these things have been happening very subtly in the EU, very, very subtly, whether it be towards Muslims, towards Black people, towards anybody that is not blue eyes, blonde hair, white, pale, whatever. It's been happening. It's just very much now in the focus of the media, I think. So in terms of the roots, I honestly do believe it goes way back in history, which is probably why it's very hard to unlearn these the human instincts that you yourself and Sarah described when it came to supporting your own, because it's been something that Europeans have encouraged for a very, very long time. I think it's very important to understand that during the colonization, who took in these Europeans, who welcomed them into their land, who told them what to do, who told them about X, Y, and Z. We have the Native Americans who were abolished by the English, who still to this day have a lost generation of children because they stripped them from their identity. Then we have the indigenous people of America, the Native Americans, who to this day are still facing discrimination, are still being underpaid, are still fighting for their laws, are still fighting for their lands. Then we have the Hawaiians who are robbed of their country, who are literally acknowledged as a nation of its own by everybody else in the world but America, who were stripped. They let these Americans in because during that time it was the season of peace. Once it was the season of, I think, I don't want to say violence, but the opposite, then they were like, why are you here? Why are you back? Why are you trying to take our lands? I think it's very important to understand that this quote unquote human instinct can be very much unlearned. But when you live in a nation and in a world where it's perpetuated at the forefront, no one wants to unlearn that at all. And it's becoming more and more of a standard all around the world. And I don't think it's okay. If I cannot sympathize with you as a human being, I'm nothing. And there's no value in that. If I can only sympathize or empathize with you because we have something in common, there's something wrong there. Because at the end of the day, the one thing we have in common is that we all have the same skeleton. We all have blood flowing inside us, all of us. And it kind of gets shoved in your face, in particular in countries such as America, where you see the treatment of animals and the treatment of Black people. That is shocking. It is shocking, and it is very, very upsetting, because the same rhetoric of I want to protect the people that look like me, but you choose to protect certain people that do look like you, that don't look like you. So for example, now let's say white Muslims, you will protect white Muslims over Black Muslims simply because they are white. Yet the fact that they're still Muslim is not necessarily catering to your beliefs. Whereas me here, I don't really care about your race. I don't really care about your religion. We have something in common. I'm going to empathize with you. I'm going to sympathize with you. I'm going to want you to be okay. And that should be the standard for all human beings. And I'm sure at some stage it was the standard, and then it was flipped on its head where it didn't become the standard anymore. So in terms of like dismantling this root, it's going to take generations, considering it took generations to get here. It's really, really, really important to understand that it's not something that is not fixable. It is very, very fixable. It's just people don't care. People generally do not care, because like you said, Eric, in terms of if it's really close to my home, I'm going to react. I can't say that for everything, but I know that when I see a Muslim being shot somewhere else, or not shot, if I see a Black person being shot somewhere else, that hits me, even though I have no idea who that Black person is. I've never met them in my life. Simply the fact that, oh my goodness, this person looks like me and did nothing and they're shot dead. Or, for example, now Islamophobia in Europe that has skyrocketed. Seeing videos of Muslim women in niqabs that are being harassed, are being judged, are being shouted at. And I'm here, I don't wear the niqab, I just wear hijab. The fact that I'm a damn skill of said niqab and I still experience such Islamophobia, whether it be through messages, whether it be through looks, whether it be in this country, whether it be abroad, it's shocking. It's really shocking. And then we boil it down to women. What about when I see a woman being mistreated? Sarah Everett, anyone that has been abused in some type of way that is a woman, I can relate to, even if I've never experienced that myself. So the idea of human beings just relating to people that look like them needs to be dismantled, because at the end of the day, we all look like each other because we all have the same skeleton. The only thing that we differentiate ourselves with is everything on top of that, and that is all psychological. That is all human thinking. Because if we really deep in the beginning of time, when human beings came, there was no such thing as racism. There was no such thing as I'm better than you, I'm this and that, because we saw each other as people who were fighting to survive in a land that we didn't know or didn't understand. And until people were introduced to this idea of race, this idea of gender inequality, this idea of religion differences, everything, yes, of course we had conflicts. That's human beings. Human beings have conflicts all the time. We all fight each other, whether it's in the same group, whether it's in a different group. But that idea of I don't care for you because you don't look like me was never to me was never truly a human instinct. It was learned. It was something that we learned. Maybe it was to fight for your people, to survive this whole nationalism thing. Maybe it was developed around that time when these ideologies were really kicking in. But
I think it's important as well to just
right.
highlight. I think it's important to just highlight as well, like in the media, they haven't explicitly gone out to say, the opposite in terms of if someone didn't look like this, that we don't empathize. I think that's important as well, because I think if it is important to note that how covert it is, how
Very
how
subtle.
how very subtle it is, and that the idea that in order to connect is to the person that is to look like them. So like Bosnians, I'm sure Bosnians have blue eyes and blonde hair, that way. So it's just it's the idea of the kind of the connection that that I'm hearing back home in the media. It's that shouldn't be what it's about. And I think I made a tweet and someone had commented and said that, well, this person didn't explicitly say that. And I'm like, oh no, I totally know that the person didn't explicitly say it. But the notion that we need those physical attributes and traits in order to connect, to feel, we don't. The fact that there are people, and that's the message I would send to Ukrainian people, is that, we're here for you and we'll be here for you till the end, you know what I mean? And we'll do everything that we can, because you don't deserve this. And, and because you are my fellow human, you are a mother, you are a father, you're a sister, you're a wife, you're a husband, you're a brother, all that. And I connect to you on that human level. And I think that's the element that people are missing. And then there's the rhetoric trope within, Western Europe, or, right-wing politicians who are taking over that narrative and actually saying, oh yes, because they are Christian and because they're this and that. And we need to stop that and nip that in the bud straight away. Because at the end of the day, Europe is not medieval Europe where everyone is, connects to or affiliates to Christianity. There's a lot of Europeans that don't affiliate to a religion anymore, you know what I mean? And that we have evolved through time, and that there are Europeans who are born Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, whatever, faith they are, but they identify as being European. And that is the Europe, and the values around, dignity and respect and, and human rights and so on, is the values that we take on as Europeans. Do you know what I mean? And that is the general kind of thing that should be going everywhere. It shouldn't be on physical attributes or, so.
No.
I was wondering, Wakila, were you trying to chime in there also?
No, like literally, Sarah finished it off really nicely there in terms of the fact that we just need to dismantle so much about what we think about each other and just bring it down to the basics, to the fact that we were all born crying and we're all going to die alone. And that if that's not a big enough connection for another human being to have, I don't know what is at this point,
Yeah, that's great. Really, really interesting points to both of you. I completely concur. And I think to what you said there, Sarah, here, if you consider these values that the three of us have been talking about throughout this conversation, Europe relative to other parts of the world, large parts of the Western world too, the parts in the Middle East, of course, also, and some parts in Africa. A lot of countries are not developed or not as socioeconomically advanced as other countries. And I think evidence proves that the more wealthier one is, on an individual level, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but on the level of the state, the more developed one is, the more one cares about issues that might not be pertaining to or related to the physiological level. The one circle of concern widens, the more they are informed, rather uplifted socioeconomically. It can apply to climate change, it can apply to global issues, it can apply to a plethora of different problems. So considering the fact that here, a place where these values that we've all spoke about, human rights, human dignity, equality, have been espoused, considering the fact that here, more so than many other parts of the world, there is a level of advancement economically that people enjoy that is not enjoyed by more disadvantaged regions of the world. It means, again, I think it adds another onus of responsibility in regards to not only speaking to these values rhetorically, but also applying these values actionably. So I completely concur with what both of you said. And the last thing I'll say on this point is that, modern, Europe, as we spoke or referenced it, and on the Western world, generally speaking, because this is where the rhetoric is coming from. This is why I refer to this part of the world in particular, and because this is where these values are espoused. It's not homogeneous. It's not made up with one face. There's various colors, backgrounds, and creeds that inform modern Europe. I made a YouTube video in Belgium where I interviewed people asking them what they thought of King Leopold II. And a lot of the young people, many of them from various ethnic minority backgrounds, spoke very angrily about him. They had a lot of disdain for him because of what he did. I imagine if I made that video 80 years ago in Europe, the reaction would not have been the same because there was a singular voice that was being represented. In modern Europe, as you said, Wakila, many of the people, ethnic minorities that come from particular nations that may have been impacted by Europe in a colonial setting or context, they have now come to Europe and they inform what it means to be European today. There's not one singular idea of what it means to be Irish, what it means to be European. And that is why conversations like the one we're having today is being had. I imagine if this crisis occurred 50 years ago, many people might not be as inclined to speak about this issue as we are because of the kind of different perspective or angle that we bring to the conversation, the different angles and perspectives that Europe now has because of the plethora of different voices represented in modern Europe. And I think it adds an interesting layer of pressure in regard to the responsibility Europe has to apply these values, because now you're tested. Now it's not merely about speaking to it. Now you have to actually appease to those who need these values to be applied. It's easy for me to be in a room on my own talking about how I have to cater to people in the house of my neighbor. But unless my neighbors are in my room and I see them and I see their struggles and their issues, I can't really speak to these issues. There's a quote from Marcus Aurelius, the former Roman emperor: "Don't just speak about your philosophy, embody it." Unless you're in a position where you need to embody it, it's easy to speak about it. But once you're in a position where you can embody it, then you have to put in the hard work. So I think Europe is in this unique position today because of these historical, chronological factors that have relayed.
And I think on those kind of like in the topic of kind of European values and so on, I think like I was hearing that back home, the discussion around, discussing our position or the definition of neutrality in Ireland and so on and so forth. And I think one thing that kind of hit me more is that I think Ireland and I think Europe needs to start maybe discussing and revisiting its European values. And what does that actually entail? And what does it mean? Because what I'm starting to see, this whole invasion of Ukraine and the narratives around it, from media to political and so on, that it has given light to the idea that everybody sees European values in a different way. And that can be very dangerous too, you know what I mean? So there is, a lot of people that will use, cite European values when they don't want to defend politically charged issues, that then actually, suppress groups in Europe and so on. So I think there needs to be a big discussion on what exactly is, Europe of today. What are our values today? What does it mean? Is it based off of Christian values? Is it connected deeply into the Christian heritage of Europe? Or have we evolved, and how are we more accepting of more of a secular kind of Europe where we, separate church and state and our values embodies and welcomes and is inclusionary of all creeds within Europe, that is growing now more and more, So I do think that we need to revisit the concept or the discussion around European values and what it actually means today in modern Europe, and that, that it does fully embody the Charter of the Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which is a legal system that, ensures the respect for cultural and religious diversity and sexual orientation and so on. So I think that's important, because I do see the language around Hungary and some Spanish congressman and the Belgian politician and French politicians and Polish politicians, that kind of irks me and makes me kind of nervous, because at the end of the day, we do need to accept the fact that certain Central and Eastern European countries will have their faith as part of their national identity. And we need to make sure that that doesn't, conflate with what European identity means. You know what I mean? That you can still have your Christian identity as your national identity, and that's fine. That no one is to impose on that, but what is a European identity as a whole? And what does that mean? And I think that's really, really important before we start jumping on to, especially for Ireland, because I think Ireland's such an influential small country. It's a mighty country, it might be small, but a mighty country that has a huge influence on diplomacy and throughout the world, that before we jump into any idea of militarization, or I do think that, it's important to, fund our defense forces and so on and have a defense policy. But we also need to discuss around that, because that's what frames it as well, is the European identity and values, and how do we feel about that?
Without a doubt, as Sarah, really well put. And I agree with a lot of what you said there. Wakila, I think your insight could be really interesting on what Sarah said there. Because, you talked about what's happening in France. And of course, France is a country that I think has a very unique model of secularism, laïcité, I believe it's called. Whereas in other countries in Europe, there's sort of a freedom of religion, a concept that is embraced to a certain extent. But in France, the approach is really aggressively anti-religious.
Dictatorial.
Yeah, it's super anti-religious, and it's linked to, I think, the 17th, 18th century, the attitude after the French Revolution that was first, secularism in a strict, stern manner, which was possibly understandable then in a political context, but today in modern Europe might not be tenable, considering the fact that there are Muslims across Europe, there are Hindus across Europe, there are a lot of religious minorities who have a different relationship to the religion than the traditionalist relationship that might be conceptualized vis-a-vis Christianity and European identity. So to Sarah's point about what it means to be European, or let's say, like in your case, Togo and European, or my case, Nigerian and European, in Sarah's case also, Arab. Exactly. What do you say to this? And how does this present a unique challenge to Europe in regards to actually embodying its philosophy, living by its values in this unique age that we live in?
Do you want to go first, or will I go first, Sarah?
No, it's for you. It's for you. I said my part.
I think it's a very big conversation, and it's a conversation that every country needs to have within itself before they come together as Europeans. Because there are some countries where there's not much in terms of discrimination against religions, color. There's not much of that, so they might not have as much to contribute to the conversation as other people would. But then there are countries where there is a very clear problem where people are fighting, but they're being hushed. And those countries need to look at the other countries and see, okay, what can we take from them, implement into ours before we start talking about these European values that Sarah has spoke about. Because fundamentally, every country has its own values, as Sarah said. And it's important to understand that these values are great for your country, but not for a united front when it comes to the European Union in particular. As the West has a lot of control over the rest of the world, they kind of perpetuate the media's views of a lot of issues and a lot of situations. And whatever they want to say is going to be what people will eat at. So if you want to say Muslims are bad, people are going to think Muslims are bad. If you're going to say the LGBT community is really bad for children to know about, then a lot of people are going to think so as well. So it's really important that the media also is involved in this conversation, as weird as that sounds, and society, even though society is us, it's really important to understand that even though one country can do one change, unless everybody else follows that change, nothing's going to change. Absolutely nothing's going to change. And this new leader of the EU, in my opinion, should represent a new Europe. We're moving on from Angela's strict control, which was brilliant at the time, to a more equal Europe and a more accepting Europe. And the next person to take on that role must be able to understand that them as a person does not mean that they are the embodiment of Europe, if that makes sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of what can Europe do, I have no idea. I couldn't tell you. No clue. But what I can say is, what can humans do is start to relate to one another in a human manner, and not on these ideologies that we place on ourselves. Fundamentally, we need to go back to what makes us humans and actually connect to one another in that level. And then maybe the conversation will not end in anger and confusion and upset, because I'm sure it will. I'm sure a lot of people will be thinking that we're pointing fingers at them when we're not. The conversation is not linear whatsoever. It's going to be very turmoil. It's going to lead to a lot of other conversations, I'm sure. There's going to be a lot of intersectionality in terms of topics. But we just need to start at what makes us humans, and that should be the main reason as to what makes us Europeans. Because at the end of the day, we have a UN that does barely anything, that doesn't do anything. And it's powered by the West. Yet the West has a lot of control over the rest of the world. And then China also has a lot of control over the rest of the world. And it's really important to understand these powers and give them the responsibility that they so badly want to have, and hold them accountable for a lot of problems that their media has perpetuated. Do you know what I mean? It's a very tough conversation, I'd say. But I think Europe can definitely establish itself as a better nation, as a more welcoming nation for the next generation. Whether it's our generation, Eric, that does this, or whether it's the next generation that does this, I don't know. I don't care. It just has to be done, one way or the other. But yeah, I think these countries, all of us need to kind of look within ourselves, like Sarah said, in terms of Ireland. What do we hold as values of whether it's Irish values or humanitarian values? What do we actually hold? And are we actually making ourselves accountable for said values? Are we actually taking these values, doing what we're saying, and going back to reflect on what we've done? Or are we taking these values and only doing what we're saying to a certain group of people, which is what is happening now, I guess. But yeah, I think it starts within the countries, and then eventually the EU, and then eventually the UN.
And we can't be selective as well. We can't be
Exactly.
selective in our humanity.
Exactly. At all, because fundamentally that is the problem of a lot of wars. That is the problem of a lot of wars, because at the end of the day, you have one person in power that's fighting another person in power, and who gets hurt? The civilians that don't care about what's happening. They just want to live their lives. And whether it's World War One, World War Two, civil wars, invasions, anything, it's always the innocent that get hurt. And that is fundamentally what we should be focused on. Us as human beings need to stop hurting each other. There's no need for any of this stuff to be happening in Ukraine whatsoever. And although I honestly think this could have been prevented, the Ukraine crisis could have been prevented if the EU listened or helped Ukraine when they were pleading many years before this happened. If something would have happened prior to the invasion, maybe none of this would have happened. But you never know.
I think as well,
Putin kind of works by himself at this point, so.
I think as well is just to note that even just with regards to Ukrainian invasion, the invasion of Ukraine, there are going to be crises ahead that are going to come to Europe. You know, the climate change crisis is definitely inevitable. You know, so it's going to happen.
Economic
if we don't prepare ourselves by discussing those issues and discussing racism and discussing the dehumanization or selective humanitarianism and so on, that, you know, we're going to see a lot worse things happen into the future, and it's just going to be devastating. So I do think it's really significantly important as Europeans and as Irish Europeans that we understand our role, and that we also do call it out and not afraid to call it out, you know, that way when we do see it, because it's for the betterment of everyone. It's not, you know, it's not a tunnel vision just for a particular group of people. It is for betterment of society as a whole.
It's an end goal at the end of the day. It's an end goal.
Yeah, I think that is probably the perfect point to end. Thank you to both of you for joining me to this podcast episode. I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it's a conversation that really needed to be had, and I'm so glad I had the opportunity to have it on my podcast and on my YouTube channel with both of you, because I think you both raised points that are so incredibly pertinent, and points that we here in Ireland, but Europe has to consider going forward, especially in light of the situation Europe is in right now. To the convergence point, which I'm sure many people think of immediately when they see conversations like this or hear conversations like this. I stated previously, I think if anything that the two ladies have said with regard to where we have to attempt to strive towards, with regard to the documents that Europe has published, which enumerate its values, if they mean anything, we should try and ensure that we stand by them, despite the predicament that we're in. And I think if any moment presents an opportunity for us to speak to the gravity of an issue, but also to speak to other ephemeral and major obstacles or issues that exist, I think we should grasp onto that opportunity and do it. And I think this video presents an attempt to do that. So yeah, both of you did it brilliantly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm sure I'll have you back on the podcast, both of you. Sarah's been on the podcast before, but I'm sure Wakila, you'll be back, and Sarah will probably be back.